Well, good afternoon again, music lovers and opera babies around Tidewater and environs. Glad to be back with you. And, I feel this afternoon like I'm performing a real public service as perhaps I have not done before with these broadcasts. I come in and I talk about standard repertoire, Tosca, The Barber of Seville, Carmen, pieces which, although they may be new to any individual listener, nevertheless, they're known quantities, they're standards, and my job is to bring maybe my insights to a piece that you've seen or heard several times in your life, or at least have some background with. And you kind of know what to expect about Carmen. You're going to get castanets and gypsies and the whole thing. Uh, with A Streetcar Named Desire, Andre Previn's operatic adaptation of the Tennessee Williams classic American drama. I suspect that if I asked you to raise your hand, if you were familiar with this opera, I would only see a smattering of hands if you happen to have been in San Francisco in 1995 or for some of the other productions that have been staged. It is going to be, for most of you, something new. And that's good, isn't it? It's good to stretch ourselves and hear something and see something new. And of course, it is one of the great classic American dramas, so you know that it's built on solid rock, as we say, and not on sinking sand. It's going to be a very well structured piece because Tennessee Williams did all the heavy lifting in that regard. But what is it like? So I can help whet your appetite and help you know what to expect. And that's really important when it comes to opera. That word opera can mean so many things. It can mean something really just pure entertainment, almost like a Broadway musical, like we just had back several weeks ago with Johann Strauss Jr.'s Die Fledermaus. This is something different. Not all opera experiences are the same. We need to discuss that word catharsis, because I think that's what you can expect when you come to any Tennessee Williams drama, and certainly to this operatic adaptation. And we'll get to that in a moment. A little bit of the timeline. The Broadway production, the world premiere of Tennessee Williams' play, Streetcar, was in 1947. It sort of ushered in the era of Marlon Brando, made him a star in the role of Stanley Kowalski, also featured Carl Malden as his poker buddy Mitch. It featured Kim Hunter as Stella, Stanley's wife, and those three artists went on to make the very, very famous film that I'm sure many of you have seen, made in 1951 by Elia Kazan, who also directed the Broadway production. The famous film version. And in the film, the central role of Blanche Dubois was played by, of course, Vivian Leigh, who replaced Jessica Tandy, the Blanche of the Broadway run. Tennessee Williams died in 1983, and around that time, with his passing, it began to be recognized what a treasure his works were, and so you saw a bunch of revivals of Streetcar on television with Alec Baldwin playing Stanley, several others, a revival on Broadway, and I think this sort of gained some momentum. It was a crescendo that perhaps climaxed with this first ever operatic adaptation by Andre Previn. Previn is a known quantity to you, but not in this regard. Many of you know him as one of the great Hollywood film composers. Did you know that Andre Previn won an Academy Award for the film version of My Fair Lady? No, he didn't write the music, but he orchestrated it and was the music director and won an Academy Award and has done many other famous feature films. I blogged about Mr. Previn in my weekly Operation Opera blog, which you can find a link to on our homepage at Virginia Opera at vaopera.org. Because I think Andre Previn is the perfect model of a modern contemporary musician. I think the days of Arthur Rubinstein, of one-trick ponies who simply play a lot of classical music and recital and do little else, that's becoming a dinosaur. What's important for musicians these days is to be useful and be versatile. And look at Previn. He's a distinguished orchestra conductor who's been at the helm of several major orchestras, an accomplished film composer, one of the great jazz pianists, a very fine classical pianist and chamber musician as well, a teacher. He does master classes in conducting and so forth, and a composer of serious music as well as the jazz, in all forms of classical music, violin concertos, vocal music, chamber music, etc. So it's interesting to see how he spreads his wings in this, the first opera that he composed. And again, getting back to this idea of what to expect from Streetcar. Well, I'll look at it this way. The medical definition of catharsis is purging, getting bad stuff out of you. If you ingest poison, you will be given treatments that will purge those poisons, those toxins out of your body. And that's a sort of a medical catharsis. Psychiatrists use it in terms of helping us bring out traumas from our early childhood that are maybe repressed memories and preventing us from living well-balanced, well-adjusted lives. And once we bring those bad memories, those traumas to the surface, then we kind of feel cleansed and purged, and we can go on. And actually, in the arts, Aristotle in ancient Greece was the first one to apply this to drama. Aristotle's theory was that by watching drama in which the characters suffer, in which they have adversity, in which they are doomed, that we can empathize with them, we can vicariously experience their hardships, and then feel very life-affirming reactions to that when we leave the theater and realize it didn't really happen. We're okay. We weren't cursed by the gods. We're going to go on. Maybe a little like waking up from a terrible nightmare. And if you've ever had that experience and for just a moment you panic when you're first awake, and then you realize, oh no, I wasn't walking naked in the Easter parade and people laughing at me. I'm fine. There's a little bit of a catharsis in realizing that. Well, this is what we're going to expect in this timeless drama that is almost Shakespearean in the way it plays out with human psychology. We're following, of course, Blanche Dubois, a tortured Southern belle of the old school, as Rhett Butler would have said, moonlight and magnolias from a plantation house in Mississippi. We gradually watch the destruction, the unraveling of her mental state until she arrives on stage in a fragile condition and ends up institutionalized in an asylum. Tennessee Williams' works were semi-autobiographical. Blanche is based in part on the playwright's sister Rose, who was mentally unstable and later institutionalized for the rest of her life. We see that Blanche has issues when she first enters, both in the play and in the opera. She's come to her sister Stella's house in New Orleans. She's left home for good. We gradually find out her story. We see her searching for alcohol and realize she's an alcoholic. We find out that she's lost her job as a high school English teacher. We find out that she has a sordid sexual past, that she lost the family plantation, that couldn't keep up the payments on it, and on until finally she is a totally deconstructed human psyche and slips into madness. And it's interesting to see. I'm going to help you now discover a little bit about how Andre Previn has approached this drama and all of the characters. I'm going to play you a little bit of the you would expect that a major orchestral conductor would have some pretty good chops in the area of orchestration. And indeed, the orchestration is extravagantly colorful and varied throughout this opera with a lot of influences. It's set in New Orleans, and Previn is a jazz master. So is it a jazz opera? No, it is not, although jazzy riffs do appear from time to time, simply when it's appropriate for the psychology of the scene. And actually the first two chords that you hear in this excerpt from the prelude to Act 1 we're about to hear are an example of that. You're going to hear two chords, and these two chords you will hear innumerable times, dozens of times. They are a kind of a landmark for your ears to latch onto. They have a bluesy sound, and I'm going to tell you right at the outset, they mean something. When you hear these two chords, they mean sex. Okay? They are the sexual chords. And sexual chords in the sense of sordid sexual dissolution, sexual debauchery. They also kind of refer a little to the bawdy, open, anything goes lifestyle in the seedy section of New Orleans in which Stella and Stanley live. And there's something else to listen for in this orchestral excerpt. Following those blues chords, you'll hear instrumental solos and woodwinds and brass, which are not melodic in the sense that we're used to in other opera composers. They kind of wander all over the place. And I think that's a dramatic device because poor Blanche is on an odyssey. She is on a journey that's taking her, she's bouncing from place to place in search of safety, in search of a life preserver for her terrible, tortured soul. And it's going to end in death. And then at the very end of this short excerpt, listen for a trumpet solo, and I'll tell you what that means. So here's how the opera opens with A Streetcar Named Desire. Ah, did you catch that trumpet solo right at the end? Pardon my not very elegant recapturing of it. That da 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 da. That's something that I want you to listen for and grab onto and recognize when you hear it, because you'll hear vocal lines like that. I think that trumpet solo represented Blanche Dubois. Very often, Blanche is given vocal lines that have that contour, that shape. And what I mean by contour is that trumpet solo was ascending. It started lower and went up, and in a kind of a zigzag fashion, higher and higher, until you thought it was going to sort of spin out of control. Blanche frequently has vocal lines like that. I'm going to play you two or three of those. No one else in the opera does. Not Mitch, not Stella, not Stanley. And I think that this is Andre Previn's attempt to characterize Blanche Dubois, because her personality is spinning out of control. I always think of the scene in the movie with Demi Moore, Ghost, in which she had a pottery wheel. If you've ever watched people spinning clay on a pottery wheel, it's very delicate. You have to be careful, because if you lose control of that clay, it can start going all over the place, and pretty soon it's splattering out of control against the walls. And this is really what's happening to Blanche's emotional and mental status. So here's some examples. In fact, Blanche's very first words, "They told me to take a streetcar named Desire," as soon as she walks onto the set immediately after this prelude. Listen to the contour of this vocal line.
They told me to take a streetcar named Desire, then transfer.
Did Did you hear that? Yeah. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Kind of zigzaggy, out of control climbing. So many examples of this. I mean, it would take the all day to show you all of them. Here's a couple of others. After Stella arrives to find that her sister Blanche is unexpectedly there in her apartment, Blanche says, I hope it's okay if I stay with you a while. I just don't want to go to a hotel. And when she says, I'm not going to put up at a hotel, there's panic and anxiety. She doesn't want to be alone. She needs to be with people. And listen to that vocal line. There's another example, and I've got one more short example for you. Blanche is telling her tale of woe to her sister Stella. Blanche's family, she had to play nursemaid to them while her father, her mother, and her sister all got terribly ill and died long, slow, agonizing, physically disgusting deaths. They all got bloated and she just went through hell watching them in their final days. So here she is describing the last days of her family. Father, Mother, Margaret. Everything is spinning out of control. She's hanging on by the tips of her fingernails, this poor woman. I'll show you a way in which those jazzy, bluesy, sordid, sexual chords that we heard in the prelude recur and are used by the composer in a way that is very typical of opera composers. Here he's showing that he understands the function of opera music. And what I mean by that, listeners, and you've heard me say this before if you've ever heard me talk about opera, it's not the job of opera music just to depict the emotional affect that people have when they're saying words. Very often, the orchestra has the job of giving you the subtext to the words in the libretto. It's the job of the orchestra to let you know the thought balloons, what people are thinking, even when they're not saying it out loud. Now, when Blanche first arrives at the apartment in New Orleans, the upstairs neighbor is there. Stella isn't home yet. And she's making chit-chat, and she says, I hear tell that you come from a big, fancy plantation house in Mississippi. And Blanche says, oh, yes, Belle Rêve. That's her bad French. It's really Belle Rêve, beautiful dream, which is very symbolic, by the way. You know, this is not only, it's an allegory. This play is not only about the doom of this individual woman. It's also about the doom of the Old South, the genteel, romantic lifestyle of the Old South that comes into conflict with the modern age, just as the Southern Belle Blanche comes into conflict with the unromantic, all-business Stanley Kowalski. So you'll hear when Blanche sings about Belle Rêve, there are very lush, romanticized chords in the orchestra, but then listen to what comes immediately after that.
And you're from Mississippi, yes. I seen a picture of your home place. A great big place.
Well, now, what was that right at the very end? Those were those two sexual chords that we heard twice, very faint, kind of in the distance. What does that mean? That's a thought balloon. Blanche doesn't say anything because she's still trying to keep up appearances. She still has secrets she's not ready to tell. The secret is that her hometown in Mississippi now represents something shameful to her, the sexual depravity in which she lived the last several months in which she was in Laurel, Mississippi. And so the orchestra tells us that by playing those chords. That's her making that reference in her mind. So that's how opera music should function. Well, Stella is all, not only is Blanche telling Stella in this opening scene about what her life has been recently, she explains that she's taking a sabbatical from her high school job. Actually, she was fired in disgrace for seducing a high school boy. But then Stella starts talking about her situation and how much she loves her husband Stanley. She is really in love with him. And so she gets an aria. She's the seconda donna, the second soprano. She deserves one aria, not as many as Blanche. And so we're going to listen to Stella's aria, in which she talks about how she just can't stand it anytime Stanley is away. She goes desperate. She's really got an animal physical attraction, a physical need for him, with his kind of brutish way of satisfying her sexually. And so there's two things I want you to listen for. Number one, you will hear several recurrences of a short musical idea, which is in fact one of those motifs that we often get in opera. It is a love theme. Ya-da-da-da-dum. Those 5 notes. Dee-da-dee-da-dum. That is Stella's love theme. In fact, it sort of stands for love regardless of who's in love. And then towards the end of this, it starts to, when I was first listening to this aria, I thought it reminds me of something. What does it make me think of? See if it reminds you of anything, and then I'll tell you on the other side. Well, that should reassure you, my opera friends. If you were afraid that coming to the Harrison Opera House to hear a modern contemporary opera was going to mean it was going to sound like aardvarks in heat and pots and pans banging and so forth, there was nothing wrong with that, was there? That you didn't have to plug your fingers in your ears, did you? That was kind of nice. In fact, it was so nice, I was thinking, where have I heard music like that? Well, I think that Previn is a composer who feels like music history is a palette of colors from which he can draw. There are all sorts of homages and tips of the cap, I think, in his first opera. These would include Aaron Copland, of course, his jazz that he's so good at, Johann Sebastian Bach, the Swingle Singers, Richard Strauss, and in this case, I am thinking Puccini. In fact, now that you've got Stella's aria in your ear, listen to this excerpt from the slave girl Liu in Act 3 of Puccini's Turandot. This is when the slave girl Liu, who's in love with the unknown prince Kalaf, tells Turandot that you too are going to fall in love with him. See if you hear the similarity. I think your head is probably nodding in agreement with your friend Glenn. Yep, that there is a Puccini-esque, in fact, there was the little device of an instrumental solo in between phrases there, and a cut from the same harmonic cloth in many ways. So that's fine. That brings us to the end of the first scene. Scene 2 is where we meet our antagonist. You know, he's not really a villain. In an interview, well, actually in a letter that Tennessee Williams wrote to Elia Kazan prior to the Broadway production, he said that he doesn't look at it as heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys. He says there really aren't good guys and bad guys, that people are just, they have differing agendas and they don't understand each other, and there's very little real communication in the world. Stanley Kowalski, though he does things that we don't approve of, he's got them all rationalized. He sees Blanche as a phony, as a threat, as someone who's conniving to deceive his poker buddy Mitch and try to trap him into a marriage based on false premises. He sees her as somebody bad, to be rude, to be purged out of his life. But here we're going to meet Stanley, and the instrumental prelude to scene 2 gives us a total contrast, music that we haven't heard so far, music of masculine energy. And when I listen to this, I'm thinking Aaron Copland. How about you? Maybe a little rodeo or Appalachian Spring there, but it does a good job of conveying the primal energy and total testosterone, which is Stanley Kowalski. Now, it's interesting, to see Tyrannosaurus Rex versus King Kong, to see these two big personalities kind of dance around each other prior to their heavyweight fight in the final scenes. So the first scene between Blanche and Stanley is coming up, but we already see the big issue that Stanley has with Blanche Dubois when he discovers from Stella that the family plantation has been lost and had to be sold off and so forth. He is livid because he was expecting this to be part of his inheritance. And he's scolding and upbraiding his wife Stella, throwing a temper tantrum because this is bad news for him. He feels he's lost out financially through some kind of devious behavior on the part of his sister-in-law. Now, interesting to listen to Stanley's music. Stanley Kowalski is a gigantic part. It takes a supreme artist, a great actor, as well as a great, powerful baritone, and he gets no arias. Not one stinking aria. How could this be? Did Andre Previn just forget? No, it has to do with the nature of the character. Arias are by their nature reflective. If there's a scene between Dwight Davis and me, and Dwight comes in and says, "I have bad news for you, Glenn," and I say, "What is it?" He says, "You better sit down." "Okay, I'm sitting. What happened?" "Glenn, your hamster was just run over by a garbage truck." And then Dwight leaves. Well, now we've had dialogue that advanced the plot. Now I'm going to emote. I'm going to sing an aria in which I wax poetic about my feelings. "My poor little hamster, my heart is breaking." And that's my aria. But you have to be a contemplative, reflective person who has an emotional life in order to be able to express yourself in an aria. That's not Stanley. Stanley never reflects. The only emotion that he has is anger. And that doesn't, and his language is very unpoetic. All he does is lecture people and lay down the law, which is not the kind of verbal expression that lends itself to arias. So I compare Stanley's music to what the first operas might have been like in the Florentine Camerata when opera was invented 400 years ago, in which you didn't have arias in those operas either. It was all recitative. It was what they were trying to recapture Greek drama, And the music was intended to be nothing more than heightened speech made larger than life. So it's important with Stanley's music that you don't need the super titles. You should be able to understand every word he sings. Well, let's test that. Here he is explaining legal issues, what he thinks are legal issues, about a division of property to his wife, Stella.
Let me enlighten you on a point or two. In the state of Louisiana, we have what is known as the Napoleonic Code.
Oh, still, I can't.
What that means is what belongs to you belongs to me, and vice versa. Looks to me like you've been swindled, baby, and when you get swindled, seems to me like I get swindled too.
You understood every word of that. That's what I'm guessing. The orchestra was kept down, muttering underneath him so that it wouldn't cover him. There would be no danger that the words would be lost. That's by calculated design. That's on purpose. So that's a lot of what Stanley's role consists of. Don't expect luscious, gorgeous, soaring melodies from Stanley Kowalski. But you do get a lot of really interesting dialogue and conversation in which, again, Andre Previn gets to show that he understands how to use opera music to convey subtext. There's a scene in which Stanley's going to have it out with Blanche and lay down the law, and she thinks that she's going to handle him the way that all Southern belles handle men, with flirtation and slightly sexual manipulation, even though it's her sister's husband. You know, she's going to flirt with anybody. She is a flirt. She is a wanton, a trollop, actually, at this point. So she's trying to diffuse Stanley's anger. She asks him to help button up her dress. I have to ask a favor of you, button up my dress. Well, right away, that's a kind of an intimacy, isn't it? And Stanley tries to button the dress, but he can't do it. The buttons are too little. And Stella says, "Oh, you men with your big hands." Well, that is rather blatantly sexual. Friends, there could be children listening here, but she ain't talking about hands, okay? Now, when she says that, when he's standing right next to her and her dress is not completely buttoned up and she's talking about, "Oh, you men," and so forth, what do we hear in the orchestra? You've heard it before. You heard it in the prelude. You heard it talking about Belle Reve. Listen to it now.
How do I know?
You look okay.
Oh, you men with your big hands.
There were our seedy, dissolute, bluesy sex chords. So this is the orchestra signaling us, like with hand signals, like an NFL referee, sex, 15 yards, to let us know that this is the chemistry between them. There is a sexual chemistry between Blanche and Stanley, and it's unhealthy. It's not well adjusted, and it will end, of course, with the shocking rape of Blanche Dubois by Stanley Kowalski. But this is just planting that seed in our minds at this early stage. And later, she's still trying to manipulate him. He's not really playing along. He doesn't respond like all those nice Southern Cavalier boys in Mississippi did. He doesn't play the flirtation game. She tries to get him to compliment her again. And when he doesn't, she says, "Oh, I was just fishing for a compliment." And listen to the vocal line. Tell me what you notice about the contour of the vocal line when she says, "I was just fishing for a compliment."
But look at me now.
You look okay.
I was fishing for a compliment.
Was that the zigzag climbing motive that we had before, like we heard in that trumpet solo? Da 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 da. Yes, it was. And what does that mean? That means insecure, anxious Blanche, her feeling that she's losing her grip on life and on her identity, slipping out of control. And why that line? Well, she's trying to get him to say that she's beautiful. He won't say it. And so one of the things that she's panic-stricken about is that she's getting old. It's too late for her to catch a man. She'll never be happy. She'll never be married because she's losing her looks. So again, the vocal contour of that line is calculated to clue us in the way that opera music does that everything in her life is spinning out of control, including her physical appearance. Well, if I were to ask you to name one iconic moment from the film of Streetcar Named Desire, you know what it would be. I know what it would be. It would be Marlon Brando standing at the foot of a staircase, looking up at the upstairs apartment where Stella has retreated because he lost his temper and struck her. And she says, "I'm never coming back." She runs upstairs, and he's instantly remorseful the way all wife abusers are. "Come back, baby." And Marlon Brando famously yells at the top of his lungs, I'm not going to blow out the equipment here in the studio, but, "Stella!" And this was a kind of acting that was new in American drama and led to a career for many impersonators following Marlon Brando. So what are you going to do if you're the composer setting that moment? You're going to have Stanley sing it? Stella, Stella. No, I don't think so. The audience would burst out laughing no matter how you had him sing it. Well, let's hear how that scene works. Actually, he's going to scream it at the top of his lungs, and I guess there's a way to do that without injuring your vocal cords so you can't sing anymore. I don't think I could do that. Let's see how Rodney Gilfrey does it in this recording. And also, I want you to listen. You will hear some jazz. This is the first time that you'll hear some real wailing jazz style music. It's not real jazz. Jazz is improvisatory, and this is all written out. This is that moment when Stella appears at the top of the staircase in response to Stanley's screaming her name and begins her slow descent, giving him a 1,000-yard stare in which their eyes are locked together in pure sexual need. And you'll know the moment at which he takes her in his arms because you'll hear that love motive. Dee-da-da-dee-da-dum. So here's the big Stella moment from A Streetcar Named Desire.
You can't be a woman and then call her back. She won't come. Baby.
Eunice, I want that girl down here with me.
Streetcar.
Stella.
Ya-da-dee-da-dum. There it was, the theme from Stella's love song, her homage to her love for Stanley in the first scene, reappearing, and that's a way in which a composer acts like a stage director. I haven't seen the rehearsals at the Harrison Opera House for that scene, but if our director does not have that be the moment when they launch into each other's arms, he's not paying attention to the music. I'm sure he will. And, I think that Tennessee Williams was aware that the themes, that there was some overlap in the themes of his drama with that of the famous film Gone with the Wind, in the disappearance of the Old South in the face of changing times. And I think that he's embraces that. I think that this scene reminds us of the scene in Gone with the Wind when, after they've had a spat, Rhett Butler takes Scarlett in his arms, carries her up those stairs, and obviously ravages her all night long. And the next morning, we see Scarlett looking like the cat that licked up all the cream, very sexually satisfied and humming a little song to herself in sublime, fulfilled contentment. Well, that's what happens following this scene when, indeed, Stanley slings Stella over his shoulder and carries her off into the bedroom as the lights go down. The next morning, she is sprawled out, turned up in the bed, humming a tuneless, a wordless little hum. And Andre Previn makes an interesting choice here. Yes, it is jazzy, but it's a particular kind of jazz. It's a kind of jazz that we heard in the 1960s with Ward Swingle, who got a vocal ensemble, took the instrumental works of Johann Sebastian Bach, upped the tempo a little bit, put drums, put percussion and string bass underneath it, and voila, you had jazz. If you've never heard the Swingle Singers, it's really cool. I want you to listen to it a little bit because Stella's going to have her Swingle moment. Here's the Swingle Singers performing a Largo from a Bach harpsichord concerto. Yeah, that is the affect that Andre Previn decided would be appropriate for this moment, the morning after a night of rough, hard sex in which Stella has just been fulfilled very much. So here is the way in which he transfers that Swingle Singer's Bach jazz effect into the texture of his opera. Here's Stella. And there you have it. A lot of what happens in Act 2 of Streetcar is the doomed romance between Blanche and Stanley's best friend and colleague at work, Mitch. Mr. Mitchell, that everybody calls Mitch. Mitch, is impressed with Blanche's act. She's trying to act refined and ladylike and pure as the driven snow, even though she's no such thing. And Mitch is falling for it. He sees her as the answer to his dreams because he's kind of a mama's boy. He's afraid he's never going to get married. He lives with his mother. And so we're going to get a little bit of an abortive romance and courtship between them in Act 2. And here again, I was reminded of Puccini, not so much the way the music sounds, but an interesting dramatic structure. In La Bohème, there's a moment that I thought was unique in opera. Usually, one aria is followed by more dialogue. You very rarely have an aria, applause, 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 and then immediately another aria. That's unusual. You have to have recitative or advance the plot somehow. Of course, in La Bohème, when Rodolfo meets Mimi, that's exactly what you do get, kind of breaking the rules a little bit. Rodolfo sings his famous Che gelida manina, in which he introduces himself and tells his hopes and dreams and so forth. And then immediately after the applause has died down, Mimi begins Mi chiamano Mimi, in which she tells about herself. They're introducing each other. Well, this is what happens in Act 2 of Streetcar. There is a Mimi Rodolfo moment, but it's kind of bizarro Rodolfo and bizarro Mimi, because rather than two nice, well-adjusted positive, life-affirming young people falling in love. We've got two hopeless cases, a pathetic mama's boy talking about this is my last chance, and then Blanche reveals one of her secrets in her aria, which is that her first marriage at age 16 ended in disaster because she discovered her husband, young Alan Gray, was a homosexual, and when she expressed her disgust at that, he blew his brains out right in front of her. Yeah, really sweet. However, the dramatic structure is the same. Here's a little bit of bizarro Rodolfo in Mitch's aria. And with no pause whatsoever and no further dialogue, we launch right into Bizarro Mimi as Blanche, half talking to, maybe 20% talking to Mitch, but 80% just reliving it for herself, recounts the sordid story of her first husband's suicide. Well, I said that this romance was doomed. That's because Stanley does a little detective work. He makes some inquiries back in Mississippi and learns the whole truth. He learns that Blanche was fired for seducing the high school student, that she moved into a cheap hotel in the outskirts of town called the Flamingo, in which she entertained a parade of young men night after night, perhaps trying to assuage her guilt over her husband's suicide, perhaps trying to become her husband, trying to understand the attraction that he had for young men. Who knows? Would take Sigmund Freud. But Stanley realizes this is no love match for his best friend Mitch, so he tells Mitch all about it, and Mitch confronts Blanche. He feels betrayed. He feels he's been lied to, and of course he has been. And Blanche makes her defense, again, with her grip on reality starting to slip away in front of us. She makes her defense in one of the great highlights from this opera, an aria called I Want Magic. And she says, "You're absolutely right. I lied to you. That's what I do. I lie." She says, I give people what they want to hear. I don't tell the truth. I tell what should be the truth. I describe things the way they ought to be. I don't want reality. Reality is awful. I want magic. And regardless of what you think of Andre Prebin's chops as an opera composer, you're going to have to give him this. Listen to this excerpt sung by the luminous Renee Fleming. The guy knows how to write for the human voice. He knows how to give sopranos opportunities to thrill us with their vocalism. very effective, Euland. That's one of those landmark moments that you need to anticipate and pay close attention to when you see it on our stage. That's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to give you the moments to watch for that I know that you'll enjoy. And the final scene, the tragic final scene of Streetcar Desire, does give us one of those moments. And it also gives us another homage that I think Andre Previn is deliberately giving to one of his great predecessors in the field of orchestration and operatic writing, and that would be Richard Strauss. The catastrophic event, the climax of this drama, is the moment when Blanche and Stanley are alone and they have their final confrontation. Stella is in the hospital because she's gone into labor with their baby. And Stanley's been drinking. He's a little out of control. He has all this anger towards Blanche. He snaps. He throws her down on the bed, and as the lights dim or the curtain comes down, we understand that he's going to take her sexually very forcibly. And that will be the moment that drives her over the brink, makes her lose her last semblance of reality, and pushes her into a tragic and permanent state of fantasy and delusion and total madness. They have to call for a doctor to take her away to be put in an asylum. I suspect she's not going to last very long in that asylum. I don't think she'll be on Earth for very much longer. But she's reached a strange state in her fantasy. She doesn't understand what's happening. She believes that the doctor that's coming is actually a gentleman caller, an old beau, who's going to take her away on a Caribbean cruise on a wonderful ship. And oh, won't it be wonderful? And she sings her final aria, which is her fantasy of smelling the sea air, and everything is so beautiful. And in a prophetic way, she says, I wouldn't even mind dying at sea, and it'll be wonderful when my gentleman takes me there. And here's the connection that I see with Richard Strauss. I think Andre Previn said, I know another opera in which a woman who's been going kind of slowly crazy for the entire drama, finally there's a violent act which pushes her into total madness, and that is Salome. The great drama Salome, with the libretto by Hugo von Hofmannsthal, shows Herod's stepdaughter who is very sexually promiscuous and who dances that famous dance of the seven veils for Herod, for her stepfather, in which she ends up naked. And he promises her anything if she'll dance for him. And she demands the head of John the Baptist, who is currently down in the dungeon in prison. Herod has to keep his word. He brings the severed head of John the Baptist out to Salome, and this turns off the lights in her mental state, and she begins to make perverted, disgusting, mad, passionate love to this severed head. Everybody is horror-struck, and she is quickly killed. Now, the odd thing is that, the music for much of Salome is extremely chromatic, extremely discordant, extremely tough to listen to. I love it, but it's not Three Blind Mice. It's very, very dissonant. But the final moments of Salome, as she's in this erotic fantasy of madness with this severed head, is very tonal. Suddenly, it could have a key signature. It's lush, it's beautiful, because she is blissing out, unaware of who she is and what's happening, and it's absolutely rapturously gorgeous.
Thank you.
Blanche Dubois is, it's not quite as sordid. Her story is sordid, but this moment at the end of Streetcar is not so sordid. It's kind of quietly sad and tragic, but it is kind of a Salome moment. She has slipped over the bend, permanently in a state of delusion, of fantasy, of being totally disconnected from reality. Owing to the violent act, not of a beheading of a prophet, but of her own forcible rape at the hands of her antagonist. So listen now. We've heard some lush Puccini-like music, but there is a simplicity to this music that strikes me as kind of Straussian in the contrast with some of the discordant and chromatic music that we've heard throughout much of the texture of Streetcar Named Desire. And I really believe that this is an homage to Salome. In fact, there's going to be a sweeping surge in the orchestra that sounds like a typical Richard Strauss gesture that you'll hear in this excerpt, Blanche smelling that sea air. So in the musical language of this opera and also in Richard Strauss's Salome, my point is that conventional chord progressions that are clearly in a key and that have a conventional sense of tonality are a code for madness. And yes, Blanche does leave the stage muttering to herself, to the doctor, "Whoever you are, I have always depended on the kindness of strangers," while a kind of a funeral march texture in the orchestra accompanies her. She disappears into fog and mist as she is accompanied by the doctor and the nurse, just as the last semblance of sanity is disappearing into the fog of her madness. And the curtain comes down on a great American drama. Is it a great American opera? You know, it's gotten all sorts of commentary, all sorts of reviews. I don't think we'll be able to know until 30 or 40 years have passed. If it's still being performed at that time, maybe so. But you know what? Don't go by what any critics say, whether they love it or whether they revile it, because there have certainly been reviews that loved it and praised it and reviews that have reviled it and scorned it. You need to come and see it because it's an important, we're living in a golden age of American opera, folks. William Bolcom, Ricky Ian Gordon, Jake Heggie, so many, and Andre Previn, another one, Philip Glass. This is truly it used to be that opera, the leading opera center was Italy. We all grew up thinking that Italy was the dominant culture for opera. That's not true anymore. When's the last time you heard of an important Italian opera coming out? America is the leading center of opera, and we're living in a golden age. Don't miss it. Don't say, well, I'll just wait for the Marriage of Figaro when the season closes. Please, I beg you, come and see this important opera based on the greatest American drama ever written, Tennessee Williams, and now Andre Previn's A Streetcar Named Desire. And I'll see you at the Opera House. Thanks for listening.